I want to start today with a very specific moment in time. April 28, 2025, a Monday afternoon, 12:33 in Spain and Portugal. The weather is mild, the sun is out. It is a completely ordinary spring day. People are at work, on the metro, eating lunch. The electricity grid is running normally. Spain is actually exporting electricity to the rest of Europe at that moment. And then, in less than 90 seconds, everything stops. The lights go out. The metro stops. Traffic signals go dark. Trains freeze wherever they are on the tracks. Mobile networks collapse. Hospitals switch to emergency generators. Over 50 million people lose electricity at the same time. In Spain, some areas will not get power back for up to 16 hours. In Portugal, up to 12 hours. At least 8 people die as a direct result of the outage. One person dies because their home ventilator stops working. 3 people in Spain die from carbon monoxide poisoning after using a generator indoors. This was the most severe blackout in Europe in over 20 years. Welcome back to the Cascade. I am Omid Razbani, Associate Professor of Systems Engineering at University of Southeastern Norway. In episode 1, I introduced the idea of Cascade using a near miss. I described the condition building on the US electricity grid where AI infrastructure puts pressure on the electricity grid. Today, I want to show you what an actual cascade looks like, what it feels like, and what a year-long investigation has concluded about why it happened. Because the findings are not what most people think. And by the end of this episode, I want to take you one step further to ask whether the solutions being proposed for the problem actually introduce new risks of their own, whether in fixing one fragility we are building another. That is the pattern I keep finding in complex systems, and the Iberian blackout is one of the clearest examples I have ever seen of it. Let me walk you through that morning. Spain's electricity mix that day is heavily renewable. Just before the collapse, solar energy is accounting for around 60% of electricity production, wind for about 12%. Approximately 2/3 of the total generation was renewable. This is not unusual for a sunny spring day in southern Europe. Spain and Portugal have been building renewable capacity for years, and many days they run on more than 75% renewables. The system has handled this before. In fact, just 12 days before the blackout, Spain's grid ran entirely on renewable energy for a period. But something is different on this particular morning. Starting around 9, the voltage level on the high voltage transmission network begins showing increasing variability. Not yet alarming, not a crisis, just slightly more unstable than usual. Then, in the half hour before the collapse, something unusual happens. The grid starts oscillating. Not physically, of course. The cables are not shaking, but electrically. The power flowing through the network is wobbling. 2 separate episodes of these oscillations occur before 12:33. Operators in Spain and France notice them. They take measures to dampen them. Those measures work for a while. And then things move very fast. Between 12:32 and 12:33, a sequence of generation disconnection begins. First in Granada and then in the Badajoz region of southwestern Spain. In the space of few seconds, approximately 2.5 gigawatts of generation drops off the Spanish grid. That causes voltage to spike beyond its normal operating range, from 400 kilovolts to over 435 kilovolts. And at that point, the grid's own automated protection system takes over. Plant after plant disconnects itself to avoid equipment damage. The cascade is now running on its own. By the time it is over, Approximately 15 gigawatts of generation has been lost from Spain alone, equivalent to roughly 60% of Spain's power demand at that moment. Portugal loses a further 5 gigawatts. The total disconnected loads across the Iberian Peninsula reaches 31 gigawatts. The interconnections to France and Morocco, the links that might have imported power to help stabilize the situation, disconnect automatically too, as their own protection system activate. The Iberian grid is now an island, and it has no power. Now, the question everyone wanted answered was, why did this happen? Was it a cyber attack? The Portuguese Prime Minister ruled that out within 24 hours. The ENSO-E investigation confirmed it. There was no attack. Was it renewable energy? This became the most politically charged question. Critics immediately said the high share of wind and solar had destabilized the grid. Supporters of renewables pushed back equally hard. A 49-member expert panel was assembled, drawn from grid operators and regulatory authorities across Europe. ENSO-E, the European Network of Transmission Systems Operators for Electricity, coordinated the work. They spent nearly a year collecting data, interviewing operators, and reconstructing exactly what happened. Their final report was published in March 2026 and runs to 472 pages. Their conclusion is this: the blackout resulted from a combination of many interacting factors, including oscillations, gaps in voltage and reactive power control, differences in voltage regulation practices, rapid output reductions and generator disconnections in Spain, and uneven stabilization capabilities. None of these factors alone would have caused a blackout. Together, on that particular spring afternoon, they did. The chair of ENSO-E said at the press briefing, the problem is not renewable energy, but voltage control, regardless of the type of generation. I want to come back to that statement because I think it is only part of the story. But to explain why, I first need to give you some technical background. Bear with me for a few minutes, because once you understand this, the rest of the episode will make much more sense. In the conventional electricity system, power comes mostly from large rotating generators, turbines spinning in nuclear plants, gas plants, hydro plants. These spinning machines do something most people never think about. Their physical mass stores kinetic energy, the same way a heavy flywheel does. When something goes wrong on the grid, when a power plant trips off suddenly or demand spikes, those spinning masses resist the change. They slow down slightly and release their stored energy automatically, holding frequency and voltage stable for just long enough for the automatic control system to respond. Engineers call this inertia. It is not a feature someone designed specifically into these systems. It is a physical property that comes for free with every large rotating machine. It is the grid's natural shock absorber. Now, voltage control is closely related to the inertia, but not quite the same thing. Voltage on a power grid must be kept within a narrow operating band, roughly plus or minus 5% of the target value. When large generators go offline suddenly, voltage can swing outside that band very quickly. Conventional rotating generators help stabilize voltage naturally through a property called reactive power support, which is part of how their magnetic fields interact with the grid. Again, this is not something engineers had to add specifically. It comes with the physics of spinning machines. Solar and wind power work differently. They connect to the grid through electronic converters called inverters. A solar panel has no moving parts at all, and standard inverters in their default configuration do not provide inertia or reactive power support. When something goes wrong on the grid, they do not automatically resist the change the way a spinning turbine does. In fact, when voltage swings outside the normal operating band, standard inverters are programmed to disconnect themselves to protect their own equipment, which is exactly the wrong behavior when the grid is under stress and needs every generator to stay connected. On April 28, 2025, Spain was running a grid where most of the generation was coming from sources with no mechanical inertia and limited voltage support capability. When the cascade started, the voltage spike propagated faster than in a conventional grid, and the automated protection system, each one doing the right thing for its own equipment, collectively stripped the grid bare in seconds. Now, there is an important and genuinely encouraging technical point here. This problem is solvable. Inverters can be programmed differently. If you write the control software in a specific way, an inverter can be made to behave similarly to a rotating machine. It can detect that the grid is under stress and stay connected, providing voltage support and mimicking what a spinning generator does naturally. Engineers call these grid-forming inverters. Separately, countries can install devices called synchronous condensers, large spinning machines that provide real mechanical inertia and reactive power support without generating electricity themselves. And these are making a significant comeback in grids with high renewable penetration. So the tool exists. Now let me come back to the ENSO-E statement. The ENSO-E chair said, the problem is not renewable energy, but voltage control, regardless of the type of generation. And he added, this is not about high technology, it is something we have been able to do for decades. I understand why he framed it that way. ENSO-E operates in a political environment. Saying the problem is voltage control rather than renewables protect the energy transition agenda. That is not an unreasonable position for the head of a European grid body to take publicly. But I want to push on it because I think it is only partially true. Voltage control in a grid full of large rotating generators is indeed well understood. We have been doing it for a long time, but voltage control in a grid dominated by inverter-based generation where the system dynamics are fundamentally faster and the natural inertia has largely disappeared is a newer and harder problem. The standards for grid-forming inverters were not yet in place in Spain at the time of the blackout. Continental Spain had no synchronous condensers installed. Almost no grid-scale battery storage existed, only a handful of small pilot projects. And here is what I find most significant. The warnings that these were growing risks had been sitting in a 2024 report from Spain's own grid operator for 10 months before the blackout. In February 2025, just 2 months before the collapse, Spain's parent grid company stated publicly that the system lacked sufficient real-time information from smaller generators to be operated safely, and that this increased the risk of operational incidents. So yes, it was a voltage control problem, but saying that obscures the harder question. Why was a known and documented voltage control risk allowed to persist on a grid already running at high renewable penetration? That is not a technical question, it is a governance question, and it is where I think the real lesson lives. Now I want to take this one step further, because the solutions being deployed in response to blackout introduce their own set of questions. The engineering response to the inertia and voltage control problem is clear. Deploy large battery energy storage system paired with grid-forming inverters. Install synchronous condensers. Update the software in existing wind and solar inverters And these are real solutions and they work. But do they introduce new risks? Let me start with battery energy storage systems, BESS as they are commonly called. On January 16, 2025, 3 months before the Iberian blackout, a fire broke out at the Moss Landing Energy Storage Facility in California. At the time, it was the largest battery storage facility in the world, 750 megawatts, 3,000 megawatt hours of lithium ion batteries. The fire started during a routine capacity test when a fire suppression system failed. It burned for days, reignited a month later, and forced the evacuation of around 1,200 residents. It was the fourth fire at that facility since 2019. No one died in that fire. Air quality monitoring found no long-term public health risks, and the industry has been working hard on improvements since. New fire testing standards are being developed. Better battery chemistry is becoming a standard for grid applications. The failure rates per gigawatt installed is decreasing as the industry scales. But I want to raise a systems question here, and it connects directly to what was discussed in episode 1. A large battery storage facility going offline unexpectedly, whether from fire, a fault, or protection system activation, creates exactly the same kind of sudden shock to the grid that I described when we talked about data centers disconnecting thousands of megawatts in seconds. You have built a large, concentrated piece of infrastructure that the grid now depends on for stability. If it fails suddenly, the stability it was supposed to provide disappears, and the grid may be in a worse position than before, because other stability sources may have been reduced in anticipation of the battery storage providing them. Concentration risk. It keeps coming up in complex systems. We solve a distributed problem by building a concentrated solution, and the concentrated solution becomes a new single point of failure. There is a second risk worth raising, and this one goes beyond engineering entirely. The International Energy Agency has documented that nearly all batteries used for power grids rely on China for at least one step of their supply chain. China controls around 90% of global raw material refining capacity for battery materials. It produces around 70% of cathodes, 85% of anodes, and the majority of electrolytes and separators. Think about what that means at the system level. Countries across Europe, including Norway, are building energy strategies that depend on grid-scale battery storage. Those batteries are manufactured in a supply chain that is at almost every critical step concentrated in a single country. RAND Corporation published a commentary in early 2026 making a point I find quite striking. Supply chain risk is no longer just about access to raw materials. It is about algorithms and firmware that define how the batteries operate. Countries importing batteries from Chinese manufacturers are not just importing physical hardware, they may be importing control software that can be updated remotely under the vendor's own policies. That is a new kind of hidden dependency, and it is one that the energy transition debate has not yet fully reckoned with. I'm not saying battery storage should not be deployed. It should be, and it will be. But when we ask whether a renewable dominant grid with grid-scale battery storage is more or less resilient than the system it replaces, we need to be honest about what we are trading. Less carbon, yes. Less dependence on fossil fuel supply chains, yes. But potentially more risky in certain failure modes, and a new set of geopolitical dependencies that look different from oil and gas but may not be less significant. I want to pause on the human side of this because I do not want it to get lost in the technical discussion. Trains halted mid-journey across Spain. Hospitals triaged which equipment was most critical. Cold storage failures at pharmacies put temperature sensitive medicines at risk. Emergency call lines were overloaded and in some areas unreachable. Fuel pumps at petrol stations stopped working. ATMs and card payment systems also stopped working. Rural zones reported the worst outages. Some areas were without power for up to 24 hours. Supermarket refrigeration warmed up and food spoiled. Factories halted production lines. For millions of ordinary people, the experience was disorienting in a way that is hard to fully describe. When the electricity goes, it does not just make things inconvenient, it makes visible suddenly and completely how many invisible systems our daily lives depend on, and how fragile the whole stack can be when one layer fails. We build systems on top of systems. Each layer assumes the one beneath it is stable. When a foundational layer fails, the layers above it do not gracefully degrade. They collapse together because they share the same hidden dependency, power. Now let me bring this to Norway and to Europe more broadly. Norway is in a different position from Spain and Portugal. Nearly 99% of Norway's electricity comes from hydropower. Hydro is a rotating synchronous generator. It provides exactly the kind of inertia and voltage support that was missing in Spain on April 28. When the Iberian grid needed to be restarted after the blackout, it was the stable generation from France, which has a largest fleet of nuclear plants with high inertia, that provided the frequency reference needed to reconnect the peninsula to the European grid. France contributed up to 2 gigawatts during the restoration process. Morocco supplied up to 900 megawatts through transmission lines across the Strait of Gibraltar. Norway's hydropower plays an analogous stabilizing role in the Nordic context. These are not just energy resources, they are stability resources, and their value increases as the surrounding system becomes more renewable, and therefore more dependent on external sources of inertia. But here is the tension. Norway is now attracting large amounts of data center investment precisely because of its cheap, clean electricity, as we discussed in episode 1. At the same time, Europe is building enormous amount of solar and wind capacity, and the interconnections between Norway and the rest of Europe mean that Norwegian hydropower is increasingly being called upon to backstop an increasingly renewable and lower inertia continental grid. The Iberian blackout made this tension visible, and the ENSO-E report issued 22 recommendations covering everything from how inverter-based generation must provide voltage support to how grid operators must share data across borders in real time, to how protection systems must be designed to consider system-wide effects and not just individual plant safety. The European Commission is now considering how to integrate these into EU energy regulation. This is governance catching up with technology, and it is happening because 50 million people spent a Monday afternoon in the dark. Now I want to push a little further. Spain and Portugal made a reasonable and admirable choice to transition to renewable energy as fast as possible. That choice had enormous benefits: lower emissions, cleaner air, energy independence from fossil fuel supply chains. And it had a risk that was known, documented, warned about, but not yet fully addressed. Jens Rasmussen, a Danish systems safety researcher, described this kind of situation in his work on how complex systems drift towards failure. Systems do not suddenly become unsafe. They migrate gradually towards boundaries of safe operation through a series of individually reasonable decisions, each made under real pressure with real constraints. No single decision is reckless. The accumulated effect is a system operating closer to its limit than anyone fully appreciates, until something reveals it. Spain and Portugal were in that position. The system had been moving toward a configuration it had never actually been stress tested in. The warnings were in the reports. The regulatory and investment response was not yet in place. And when a coincidence of stresses arrived on one spring afternoon, there was no buffer left. This is the hardest lesson from the Iberian blackout, not a technical one, a systemic one. Fast transitions in complex systems require very deliberate management of the transition itself, not just the destination. Norway is not immune to this lesson. Neither is any country building a renewable energy future. The destination is right. The question is how you get there without creating the conditions for cascade along the way. April 28, 2025, 12:33 in the afternoon. Normal spring day. Grid running well. Exports flowing to Europe. And then 90 seconds. A year later, 49 experts from across Europe have given us a 472-page explanation of why. Not one cause, many interacting factors, each individually manageable, together catastrophic. And now, as the energy industry responds, deploying battery storage, updating inverter software, installing synchronous condensers, new questions are forming. Is the solution as resilient as we think? What concentration risks are we building into the new system? What dependencies are we accepting without fully examining them? I do not raise these questions to argue against the energy transition. I raise them because this is exactly what systems thinking is for. Not to say stop, but to say, look carefully. Ask what you are trading. Build awareness of the whole, not just the part you are responsible for. The cascade on April 28 took 90 seconds. The conditions for it had been building for years. This is the pattern I want to keep exploring in this podcast. The slow drift towards the boundary, the hidden dependency, the gap between where warnings are seen and where action is taken. Systems do not usually fail all at once. They drift and then they cascade. I am Omid Razbani. Thank you for listening to The Cascade. Next episode, we pick a new story and find the system underneath.